Good evening, everyone. Oh, I have to remember, don't use your barnyard voice when you have a microphone. I have such a terrible habit of that. Loud talker. Never have to say, speak up, Candace. I want to welcome you all to the McLean County Museum of History. My name is Candace Summers. I'm the Senior Director of Education here at the museum. And tonight, I am pleased to feature this program of John Wesley Powell with the museum's librarian Bill Kemp, which you all know and love. Before I get started, a little bit of housekeeping. This program is being live streamed and recorded. So if you don't want it to live on the internet forever, mind your P's and Q's. Also, who are members of the museum in the room? Most of the people here. Excellent, excellent. Well, if you're not, I encourage you to join the museum as a member, because without our members and their support, we could not have programs like this free of charge and open to the public. So there is information out on the table as you leave the program this evening. Real easy. You can either fill out the form or sign up online. For tonight's program, Bill Kemp has been the museum's librarian since 2003, and he's delivered many papers on various topics of McLean County history and Illinois history all throughout his career. You may recognize him from the museum's Sunday column, Pieces from Our Past, which he was the solo writer of from December 2005 all the way up to 2020. And then the rest of the museum staff started teaming up and doing articles as well. You might not know or remember that Bill received the Studs Terkel Humanities Service Award in 2009 for his contributions to local history, and in 2012, the Illinois State Historical Society recognized the quality and impact of his weekly column with their Award of Superior Achievement. So I am pleased to welcome and introduce the one and only Bill Kemp.
Thank you, Candace, for that introduction. I've been researching, writing, and giving papers and public programs on John Wesley Powell since the late 1990s, more than a quarter century ago, but I'm far from a leading authority, even locally. Who is such an authority? Retired Illinois Wesleyan University Associate Professor Marcia Thomas. Hopefully, Marcia's listening in on this program. She put together an annotated bibliography on Powell published by Prager back in 2004, and she's been involved in other scholarly Powell projects as well. Well, John Wesley Powell, of course, is best known for something he didn't do. He did not discover the Grand Canyon, of course. In this program, we'll look at Powell's life and career with an emphasis on his ties to Bloomington-Normal, and then we'll widen the view to include some larger themes as Powell grappled with the future of the West's precarious lands and the people who called them home. So as we reflect back on 250 years of the Declaration of Independence and its promises and disappointments, it's really an opportune time, I think, to examine Powell's achievements and shortcomings within this larger story. In the spring and into the summer of 1869, Major Powell, the major part being a nod to his time in the Union Army, led a 3-month river expedition, as I'm sure many of you know, down the Green and Upper Colorado rivers, a series of canyon and rapids some 500 miles in length. The two rivers ran through the last unexplored region of the continental United States, an area about 500 by 300 miles, a rectangle cutting across southern Utah and northern Arizona. The expedition, Powell's expedition of 1869, someone noted was, quote, lucky and brilliant, as well as foolish and tragic. At the time of his expedition, what was Powell up to? Well, he was the curator of a museum of natural sciences. Where was that at? Normal, Illinois, at the Normal University right on the campus. And he was a former Illinois Wesleyan University instructor in the natural sciences. But he would leave Bloomington-Normal in a few years after his famous 1869 expedition and divide his time between the arid West and Washington, D.C. Explorer and surveyor for sure, but Powell is also remembered as a principal architect, right, of the federal science bureaucracy. He organized and then would head the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, which undertook the nation's first systematic, well, not quite systematic, but a good approach into research into indigenous lifeways. And then he led an effort to merge the 4 Western surveys, and that became the U.S. Geological Survey, and he became its second director. And as director, he led what would become the world's largest scientific organization at the time. This is a beautiful image, right? Comes from Scribner's Monthly when Powell was writing about his adventure 6 years after the '69 expedition. During calm water, and there was calm water, though they encountered more than 500 rapids during their 3-month journey, Powell would read aloud Walter Scott's novel, The Lady of the Lake, and other works. He would also sing, noted Frederick Samuel Dellenbaugh, who trekked west with Powell. What would Powell sing? Everything from the marriage of Figaro areas to way down upon the Swanee River. So here's the major, all whiskered out, right? December 1869. So this would just be a few months after the Colorado River expedition. Powell is revered by many as a river runner and explorer, as I've said, but more importantly, he now offers a prophetic voice for, if not entirely protecting, at least better managing Western lands. As author John Vernon has noted, Powell has become, quote, something of an environmental martyr, the man always quoted when historians and conservationists want to say, "I told you so." Think about right now. The Colorado River is drying up and there's not enough water for greedy agribusiness in desert cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas. So Powell has come back to tell us what? I told you so. Born in New York State, Powell spent his the greater part of his first 35 years in the Midwest, in Ohio, Wisconsin, and finally from 1851 until he leaves for Washington, D.C. In the early 1870s in Illinois. At one time or another, he could be called a part-time student because he was never really a full-time one. Farmer, amateur naturalist, teacher, soldier, professor, explorer, and scientist. He toiled under the rule of a stern religious father who frowned upon any demonstrated interest in the natural sciences, and Wes Powell, as young John was known, and his father Joseph would butt heads, right? Joseph Powell's world was defined by the King James Bible, whereas young Wes, well, one of his Bibles at least was Charles Lyell's 3-volume Principles of Geology, right? He turned away from biblical time, Noah's flood, and the rest, and instead became enraptured in what? Geologic time, which stretched hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, and now we know, of course, billions of years. During the 1850s, Powell enrolled or at least took classes at Methodist College in Wheaton, that's Wheaton College today, and then Illinois College in Jacksonville, and finally Oberlin in Ohio. None of those places, though, offered a science curriculum anywhere close to what he was looking for. He also taught in a series of public schools, several of them of the one-room variety, including one east of Decatur and another one in or just outside of Clinton. During this period, though, a driving interest in the natural sciences was taking hold. First, he began in 1856, this is in his 20s, after teaching from the fall into the spring. He would spend his summers alone on long natural science excursions. He would usually journey up and down the rivers of the Middle West, the Ohio, the Illinois, the Des Moines, and of course the Mississippi, paddling up and down them. As he was doing so, he accumulated an impressive collection of freshwater mollusks, one of the largest in Illinois, and that would be his ticket into the Illinois Natural History Society, an organization which will play a pivotal role in his career. And we should note, Powell also looted native archaeological sites with abandon, as was the practice back then, right? He would later recall excavating mounds on the shores of Lake Peoria. Lake Peoria is a wide spot in the Illinois River north of the Central Business District. This is in 1859, so he's rooting through Native American earthen mounds, and he uncovered this ornament made of copper, skillfully cut in imitation of a spread eagle. This object now is at the Smithsonian. So in May of 1861, 1 month after the fall of Fort Sumter and the beginning of the Civil War, a 27-year-old Powell enlists as a private in the Union cause. Quote, this is Powell, "It was a great thing to destroy slavery, but the integrity of the Union was of no less importance." So for Powell, the United States not only represented the last best hope of earth with respect to freedom and liberty, as it did for Lincoln, but for Powell, that hope was rested with science. And beyond it all, Powell said, was to be counted the result of the war, not only establishing in North America a great predominating nation with a popular and powerful government, but also securing the ascendancy of the Anglo-Saxon branch of the Aryan family and the ultimate spread of Anglo-Saxon civilization over the globe. Those are Powell's words, right, in 1861. Anglo-Saxon civilization here, meaning of one not only defined by race, but it was by Powell, at least at this time, but one perhaps more importantly defined by a civilization that embraces science and technological progress. That's what Powell was here for. Early in the war, Powell secured a 1-week leave of absence to marry Emma Dean, a first cousin from Detroit. So Powell marries his first cousin, yes. Powell's mother, Mary, and Mary's brother, Joseph Dean, Emma's father, though had different mothers, making them half-siblings, but it still, right, was a little dicey. Unfortunately, there's little time to spend on Powell's military career because it does influence the man he becomes and the explorer and the surveyor he becomes and the ability to lead men under difficult circumstances. But we don't have time for that. Yet we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, right, that on October 6th, 1862, while leading an artillery battery, this is the first day of the Battle of Shiloh, western Tennessee, Powell was hit by a Confederate minie-ball, losing his right arm from a point slightly below the elbow. I'll pause here to note the scale of a Civil War carnage, right? Something Americans had never seen before, right? The National Park Service tells us there were more casualties at Shiloh than in all American previous wars combined. The Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War. Just in this one 2-day battle in western Tennessee. 24,000 casualties, including one John Wesley Powell, but also 3,500 men killed. After amputation and recuperation, Powell rejoined his battery and later participated in Ulysses S. Grant's epic siege and capture of the Mississippi River Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, right? During the siege, Powell suffered from dysentery, common ailment among troops on both sides of the lines, dropped to about 100 pounds. So take about 20 pounds off my frame and you'll get an idea, right? He was in constant pain from re-exposed nerve endings in his stump. That would be a problem his entire life. Second surgery was deemed necessary, but yet he returned to action by the fall of 1863. This is an image that appeared in Harper's Weekly, the July 4th edition, 1863. during the siege of Vicksburg. And the caption is, Our works before Vicksburg, Battery Powell, right? So Powell gets a shout out by Harper's Weekly here. Although the Civil War interrupted Powell's natural collecting trips, it did not altogether end them. He found Civil War encampments, battlefields, and siege works along the Mississippi and other rivers in an ideal environment to pursue his investigations of Native American mounds and other things of interest. During the war, he rose to rank of lieutenant colonel, but he mustered out and retained the rank of major, and then henceforth would be referred to both in his professional life and his exploring life, if you will, as the Major or Major Powell more often than not. So after the war, the mostly unschooled Powell, right, became a natural sciences instructor at Illinois Wesleyan University in Bloomington. You could do that back then, right? And that was upon the special invitation of Wesleyan President Oliver Munsell. Powell was fortunate to settle in Bloomington-Normal. Not only was the community home to Illinois Wesleyan University, founded in 1857, but also the Normal University, ISNU. But most importantly, it was the home to the Illinois Natural History Society and its impressive natural history museum or collections, and those were housed on the Normal University campus in a building that will later be known as Old Main. Oh, note that Wesleyan President Oliver Munsell is the corresponding secretary for the Illinois Natural History Society. So connections also helped. That's Illinois Wesleyan's first building, Old North Hall. At the time when Powell arrived on campus, IWU was 15 years old, counted an enrollment of 200 students, but only 57 of those were taking college-level courses. Powell's connections to Illinois State Normal were not as a professor, as often understood, which is incorrect, but rather as curator of the Illinois Natural History Society's museum, which we'll get to, which was located on the third floor of the building we can see right here, Illinois State University's administration building. That's what they called it for years before it became Old Main and then torn down in the 1950s. This is, I believe, the oldest image of the university, and to the right, of course, is the town of Normal. Well, after a year or two in Bloomington, this was before he was curator and still teaching at Wesleyan, Powell saw a good opportunity and received the okay to lobby Springfield, the state legislature, for an annual appropriation for what? For this museum. And then, hey, let's add a modest stipend for a curator, whoever that may be in the future, right? Note the mistake here, right? This museum is in Normal, right, not Bloomington. The museum covered 3,300 square feet in two spacious halls, as we see here. You had stuffed birds, fossils, crystals. Much more was displayed in cases of French glass, drawers of plant specimens and more, preserved in alcohol, species of fish and reptiles. An entire section showcased Illinois' mineral wealth. This was the great era of collecting and cataloging and showcasing collections, right? Before the analysis and the study really began. That was the next generation. The Illinois Natural History Society deserves recognition in the history of 19th century American scientific organizations, if for only the fact that a half dozen or so of its members would go on to achieve prominence or leadership roles in their chosen scientific field. So it was a great incubator of then amateurs to then rise on the national level to become a botanist or an entomologist or an archaeologist, right? Or in Powell's case, a geologist. The most celebrated member of the Illinois Natural History Society was John Wesley Powell. but he unfortunately hastened the society's demise, right? He's the bad guy in the story. And by 1871, this once promising statewide organization was no more. It turned out Powell was far more interested, imagine this, John Wesley Powell was far more interested in exploring the Great West than spending his days working in a museum in central Illinois. So that whole sordid story, it's not really sordid, is the subject of my Illinois State University master's thesis on the short life and death of the Illinois Natural History Society, and I completed that thesis in 2000. Anyway, an important chapter in Powell's professional career begins with his appointment as curator, right? Because he's appointed curator to the surprise of no one. Now has the position and the resources, right, to what? Head west and explore under kind of the guise of I'm going to collect and explore the West and bring all this material back and make this one of the finest museums in North America, right? So we have to remember, prior to the famed 1869 Colorado River expedition, John Wesley Powell from Bloomington-Normal organized two very interesting, fascinating academic-oriented Western trips. The first one in 1867 and the second the following year, 1868. And he was able to do that because he became paid curator, right? And he used some of the funds that were supposed to go to the museum, right, to support those collecting trips out west. 11 students, educators, and interested observers joined Powell on that first westward trek, 1867. The party included his wife, Emma, Almond H. Thompson, his brother-in-law, who was superintendent of Bloomington schools, and then 3 Wesleyan students, Martin Titterington, Francis Marion Bishop, and Joseph Hartzell. They ventured across the Great Plains by wagon from Council Bluffs, Iowa to Denver. This was before the completion of a transcontinental railroad reaching Denver or Green River, Wyoming. Wesleyan student Joseph Hartzell sent 2 public letters or travel logs back home, which were published in the Pantograph, and his second dispatch was a detailed account of a 2-day ascent of Pikes Peak by 8 members of the party, including Emma Powell. So with a summer's worth of collecting wrapped up, that's what they were there for, right? And fall semester quickly approaching, the Bloomington-Normal group separated with most heading back to Illinois, but Powell and Emma remained in the Rockies for a few months, venturing that fall to the headwaters of the Colorado River. Quote, a result of the summer study was to kindle a desire to explore the canyons of the Grand and the Green and the Colorado rivers. That was John Wesley Powell. So after this student-oriented collecting trip in 1867, he was hooked, right? He would then spend, as I mentioned, the greater part of his life exploring, mapping, explaining, and defending its arid lands. He'll eventually return to normal, right? This is the fall of 1867. One must imagine somewhat reluctantly, and then he'll begin the work of unpacking and sorting and processing all those newly acquired items from the Rockies collecting trip. But what happens? Soon enough, Powell is planning a return trip to the Rockies. Another collecting trip, 1868, and he calls it the Rocky Mountain Scientific Exploring Expedition. He always gave these 2 trips the veneer of kind of this professionalism they never really had. Students or participants included George Vasey, a botanist and namesake of the ISU Herbarium today, Samuel Garman, an Illinois State Normal student who later became a professor at Harvard University, and L.W. or Lou Keplinger, an Illinois Wesleyan student. And once more, with the fall semester fast approaching, the group of Illinoisans headed back to Illinois, right, to unpack everything at the museum, but not Powell again, for he remained in the mountains and its parks, or what we would call valleys, with Emma at his side. Okay, we're to the 1869 Colorado River expedition, though half of it or more is on the green. And a remarkable aspect of this journey is the modest scale of the organization. The federal government, except for an allowance to draw Army rations at Army posts, provided little support. So if you don't know the topography or the layout, the Green River, that originates in the Wind River Mountains of Wyoming, flows south into Utah, curves into Colorado, comes back to Utah, and then it will merge with the Colorado River. The Colorado, of course, has its headwaters in the Rockies, and then the Colorado River will run all the way to the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of California. Well, that is, it used to reach the Pacific. Now most years all the water is siphoned away well before that happens. Of note, in Powell's time, the Colorado River, before it reached the Green, was known as the Grand River. The following group of illustrations come from Scribner's Monthly, magazine, 1875. We've already seen one of them when Powell was writing about his adventures. He designed and then had constructed in Chicago and then shipped by rail car to Green River, Wyoming, and then unloaded, this is the Union Pacific Railroad, 4 boats. 3 were 21 feet made of oak, and then there was a more maneuverable, smaller lead boat that Powell would pilot. He called it the Emma Dean. That was fashioned by pine. So at the point where the recently completed Union Pacific crossed the Green River, a party of 10 men launched 4 boats. On May 24th, 1869, a really inauspicious beginning. There was just kind of a group of locals to watch the whole thing. Members of this expedition included Rocky Mountains tracker and frontiersman Jack Sumner. He had spent the previous summer with Powell. There was U.S. Army veteran George Bradley, Billy Hawkins, who was a rumored outlaw from Missouri, Powell's brother Walter H. Powell, and others. It was a real ragtag group, no doubt about it. Powell, let it be said, right, was not a first-rank scientist by any measure, though when it comes to geology and other fields, he had what was called an instinct for cosmic interrogation. An instinct for cosmic interrogation. What's that? So perhaps this Powell quote will suffice. Quote, "It is easy to be lost in a maze of hills and a confusion of mountain peaks, unless the grand topographic forms on which the hills and mountains are sculpted are seen with a mental vision that reaches further than the eye. He who can see a mountain range or a river drainage or a flock of hills is more rare than a poet." So there's John Wesley Powell for you. When possible, the more dangerous rapids were portaged. More common was the practice of lining the boats, that is, attaching ropes to the stern and bow and guiding the boats from the bank or the shore of the Colorado or the Green. All that said, most of the rapids were simply run. The expedition, though, did lose 1 boat. It was called the No Name. That was on June 8th as they navigated a series of rapids through Lodore Canyon. Those rapids were given the name Disaster Falls. It was a disaster because although no lives were lost, Powell did lose 3 of the expedition's barometers, the only barometers the expedition had. Those were gifts by the Smithsonian, and without barometers, there's no way to make an accurate map of any consequence. So Powell's famed expedition of 1869 offered plenty of adventure, that's for sure, but little when it came to hard topographic or scientific data. Well, let's go back. Most of the men, the party initially of 10, there was an Englishman, Frank Goodman. After a few weeks, he said, "To hell with this, I'm walking back." So there were a party of 9 for most of the trip. Most of them, rough-hewn as they were, kept journals. I think it was a more literate culture back then. And they're wonderful reads. Here's George Bradley, the Civil War veteran who knew Powell. in an entry sometime after disaster falls. Quote, "The major, as usual, is choosing the worst camping ground possible. If I had a dog that would lie where my bed is made tonight, I would kill him and burn his collar and swear I never owned him." So this photograph is by James Fenimore. That's Powell's second photographer. And you can see J.K. Hillers, John K. Hillers, on the ledge there. He becomes Powell's third photographer and longtime photographer. I'm using this photograph. This comes from Powell's second expedition for its view of the Grand Canyon. There was no photographer or no photographs taken during the first expedition. But I want to go back to that first trip of 1869, that trip 157 years ago. So let's picture this scene, if you can, on the morning of August 28th, 1869. This is 3 months into the expedition. 3 members of Powell's party wanted out. They had had enough of the endless landscape, the series of portages, rapids, the isolation. Remaining men, though, successfully navigate what would become Separation Rapids, and by the next day they were out of the Grand Canyon and into gentler waters. The 3 men who scaled their way the North Canyon wall onto the plateau were killed by a band of Shivwit warriors of the Paiutes, and the circumstances for that encounter have always been kind of enveloped in mystery, and to this day we don't know quite what happened. So Powell obviously became, quite quickly, a nobody to a national hero. So acknowledging his disinterest in the museum and the Illinois Natural History Society, he heads to Washington, D.C., seeks assistance for a second Colorado River expedition, one dedicated to science, one that will create a good map, and this time he receives $10,000, a stipend from Congress, right? And he would finally resign as curator of the Natural History Society Museum in the summer of 1872. The second expedition begins where the first one did, Green River, Wyoming. This time, though, it's May 1871, taken by the first photographer, E.O. Beeman. The first photographer, he proved less than reliable, at least to Powell, and after a dispute, he left the survey in January 1872. Here's that same image we just looked at, but in duplicate, because we hold in our climate-controlled archives a set of original stereographs featuring Powell's second expedition and subsequent survey work. Stereographs, as we see here, consisted of 2 identical photo prints, which then viewed through a stereoscope, that instrument up in the upper right corner, produced an illusion of a single 3-dimensional image. Note the caption, U.S. Topographical and Geological Survey of the Valley of Colorado, J.W. Powell and A.H. Thompson, Alman H. Thompson, the former superintendent of Bloomington Schools, is now a federal surveyor, right? That's how they rolled back then. No, the boats of the second expedition were not those of the first. The same month of this photo, I take that back. So I've got this photo dated September. So a few months before this photo, June 1872, Powell will resign as curator of the museum in Normal, and he'll purchase a home in Washington, D.C., and that will pretty much sever his ties to what we today call the Twin Cities, though he will return from time to time. Looking again at one of those stereoscopic slides, we're near the head of Desolation Canyon. Powell and his men got the name, right? All in the hubris of the age, right? Got to name all of these canyons and rapids. So we're at the head of Desolation Canyon on the Green River. The natural amphitheater is named for expedition member Jack Sumner. So Cataract Canyon, 46 miles long, begins at the confluence of the Colorado and the Green Rivers, and through those stretches of its lower half today are submerged under Lake Powell, the artificial lake created by Glen Canyon Dam. More on Lake Powell in a moment, right? In addition to the geological and topographical work Powell was doing, first exploring the Green and Colorado rivers, and then getting up on the plateau and exploring the dry lands above, right? He and his survey team began to expend increasing energy on what? Studying the languages, customs, and material culture of native peoples. In many ways, that was Powell's true love. What they called ethnology, today anthropology, right? The study of indigenous peoples. So he's known mostly as a geologist, but in his latter years, he gravitated certainly to ethnology and later philosophy as well. This was taken by his third photographer, John K. Jack Hillers. The Paiutes gave Hillers, the photographer, the name Myself in the Water, which makes sense, right? Hillers accompanied Powell and the famed painter Thomas Moran on a visit to the Paiute communities. This would be 1873. The photographs resulting from this visit illustrate the problematic nature, though, of ethnographic photography during this period. For example, Powell would dress the Paiutes in pseudo-Indian clothing made by Ellen Thompson, that's his sister. Why would he do that? Well, so the Indians would appear more Indian-like, right, than the Paiutes themselves, right? And he would have them wearing feathered headdresses, which would be completely alien to them, as opposed to close-fitting caps, right? So you can't ignore those things, certainly. Nonetheless, Powell did recognize, unlike many of his peers, the humanity and the complexity of indigenous people and their cultures. So around this same time, in the spring of 1873, he's hired by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to investigate the condition and wants of Great Basin Indians, including the Paiutes. His report, submitted later that year, at the end of the year, argued against the military policing of Indians. He said reservations should not be treated as, quote, a pen where a horde of savages are to be fed with flour and beef, to be supplied with blankets from the government bounty, and to be furnished with gewgaws by the greed of traders. No, a reservation should be a school of industry and a home for these unfortunate people. So in other words, Powell respected Native American people, yet he believed assimilation, right, into Euro-American agricultural ways, into our free market, industrial, commercial world was the only path to survival. And likewise, Powell was a conservationist, though one in a way like Theodore Roosevelt was, right? A nation conserves and protects, say, its forest land, so it continue to what? Harvest that timber. In other words, public lands are first and foremost a resource for a nation's benefit and economic growth. The key is to use those resources wisely, right? All that said, an admirable quality of Powell in his time and in ours, right, is that he cared first and foremost about science, about the data. He never fattened his pocketbook like most everyone else in the Gilded Age, right? That was the most corrupt period in American history. If you look at society, economics, politics, right? Powell kept his nose clean through it all because he only cared about the science. Yes, in today's academic parlance, Powell here is caught, I think, in an act of cultural appropriation, right? But men like Powell, who led these Western surveys, who were studying indigenous peoples, right? This was kind of the thing that they did. Anyway, as previously noted, Powell organizes and then heads From 1879 until he dies in 1902, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology. So it's the annual reports and it's the monographs of the Bureau of Ethnology, with Powell directing it all, that provides us today with an indispensable record of indigenous peoples during a period, the latter half of the 19th century, of cultural and linguistic extinction, right? So Bureau researchers, not Powell himself, but researchers, right, were dispatched across the nation, mostly to the west, but not only to the west, to study languages, family structure, tribal dances, agricultural practices, material culture, child rearing, and more and more. And this is one reason why Powell's legacy rests primarily not as an explorer, as exciting as all that was, but rather as a federal bureaucrat, right? So you never know. Let's now turn our attention to the arid lands of the West, one of Powell's fascinations, not quite obsessions, and his vision for the nation to sustainably develop those lands, right? But let's go back a little bit. 1785, the U.S. government, yes, but this is before the Constitution, so we're still under the Articles of Confederation. 1785, the Public Land Survey System. It provides a brutally efficient method to survey, sell, and develop public domain land, land that has been acquired by the federal government through hook and crook from native peoples, right? And then you want to distribute that to capital, to speculators, and to homesteaders, right? So an extremely efficient homesteading engine, right? But also an engine of destruction for indigenous peoples. The basic unit of this geometric grid of this land system, right? We see it here in this original survey of what would become McLean County, was the section, 1 square mile. That's what all those squares are, right? 640 acres. So you could sell and develop and farm half of the country using this system, right? Ideal homesteads were often what? 160 acres, which was a quarter of a section, right? Such a scheme is fine for the humid Midwest, Powell said, but what about the arid West? So after the Civil War, politicians, mostly from the West, but not only, land promoters and others were selling the West, the semi-arid and even arid West, as a fertile paradise. Powell knew better, right? There was even this idea that rainfall would follow the plow, right? A pseudo-scientific theory that held that human activity, such as farming, would transform semi-arid or arid lands in the wetter areas conducive to rain-fed agriculture, right? For Powell, that kind of talk was dangerous, right? You're setting people up, right? Homesteaders, people that can ill afford that, you're setting them up for failure. So for Powell, they had pretty accurate rainfall measurements for much of the country about the decade after the Civil War. For Powell, the great demarcation line was the 100th meridian, right? Dividing the humid half of the nation and the far drier half. The great Canadian rock band, Tragically Hip, right, sings the 100th meridian, where the Great Plains begin. In his landmark 1879 report on the lands of the arid region of the United States, he should have given it a snappier title, and in all the work that followed and his public speaking and his lobbying, Powell contended that without radical land use reform, and I don't like to use the term radical, but in this case it's appropriate, yes, radical land use reform. Western lands, if not, Western lands would be in danger of falling into the control of large combines of capital, private capital, mining, cattle, and grain trusts. This is Powell talking, right? And the West's most valuable resource, right? What's the most valuable resource? Water, because of its scarcity, would come under the control of the few rather than the many, right? Powell understood better than many the tremendous disparity in rainfall meant that central Utah could not be settled in the same manner as central Illinois. Homestead in the West, he argued, should be laid out not according to a geometric grid, but rather that it should what? Follow the water. That is, they should mirror the contours of the watershed and the local land itself, right? So farmers involved in livestock would not need 160 acres, but 2,560 acres, right, of rangeland for pasturage. But if you had irrigated cropland, perhaps you only needed 80 acres, right? Suffice to say, these and Powell's other proposals for developing Western lands in a more organized and sane manner would never become the law of the land. He was butting up against manifest destiny and the American dream. As I said, Powell helped organize and then became the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey. As survey director, he became entangled in a brutal political battle. It was a sprawling, nearly all-encompassing Western irrigation survey that ended for Powell in another big legislative defeat. Powell biographer John F. Ross has called this Earth's first ecological map. Well, I'm not sure about that, but it does encapsulate visually, I think, for what I was just talking about, Powell's approach to westward expansion. Powell's Arid Lands report remains influential and has been reprinted several times, such as in 2004 by the University of Nebraska. Powell did not get everything right, of course. For one, he underestimated the ability for us to draw billions upon billions and billions more gallons of water from where? Deep western aquifers, right? Sucking those babies dry. We've been very good at doing that this last century. Powell did not also envision public works projects on the scale of the Colorado Big Thompson project. What does that do? That collects water in the headwaters of the Colorado River. That's on the west slope of the Rockies, right? And then diverts it to Colorado's Front Range on the east slope. And it does that, right, by transporting or moving that water in a 13-mile underground tunnel that bridges the Continental Divide, right? Powell could not envision anything of that nature, right? But Powell now is in the news more than he was certainly 20 or 30 years ago as the planet warms and as the West struggles through a mega drought, now more than a quarter century long. A lot of people are asking about this guy, Powell, and what about those radical ideas of his, right? Because the 1,450-mile Colorado River is the most fought over and most managed rivers, or one of the most managed rivers on the planet. Every single drop of this river set aside for its users. And who are those users, right? 40 million people in 7 states. Agriculture, by far the biggest user. Tribal nations, and also Mexico, right? The 2 largest human lakes in the U.S. Are on the Colorado River. Lake Mead, created by Hoover Dam, of course, during the Great Depression, and then further upstream, the newer Lake Powell, created by Glen Canyon Dam, completed in 1963. 2 massive dams creating the 2 largest human-made lakes in the United States. But there are also 13 other dams along the Colorado River that don't get the press and publicity. So the ongoing drought, this mega drought, the Colorado River Basin just had its lowest snowpack on record last winter. That's super scary stuff, right? Because the snowpack, snowfall, right, is where all the Colorado River water comes from, right? Has left both lakes at record lows. Lake Powell is now nearing minimum or dead power pool, meaning it's going to reach the point soon where the level is so low the water cannot even spin the hydroelectric turbines and create electricity. Both lakes now offer a stark symbol for the dire times we find ourselves in, bathtub rings, right? 7 states are signatories of the Colorado River Compact, which dates all the way back to the 1920s. Those states agreed to divide up the river's waters, but now it's harder and harder to share what is an ever smaller pie. There's just not enough water to go around. So the federal government is stepping in because the states, after years of deadlocked negotiations, can't agree on a plan to continue sharing the water. The mega drought and the shrinking Colorado River have been called the slowest moving train wreck in American history. But we are all culpable, right? We are all to blame in some ways, though I can't speak to everybody in this room or listening in. Think about it. In the winter, Southern California and Yuma, Arizona, right, produce most of North America's leafy greens. And those leafy greens, right, are sucking up Colorado River water. So our selfish and lazy consumer expectations and habits also contribute to this problem. So, be careful when we point the finger. Okay, I think we need to lighten things up, don't we? So let's look at how Powell is remembered locally and nationally in fine art and in popular culture, right? So let's have just a little bit of fun, right? First, the fine art. Rick Harney's statue, dedicated in 2002, located at the Ames Library Rotunda on the Illinois Wesleyan University campus. If you haven't checked out the major, please do so. And of course, the Rotunda also has a wonderful display of indigenous material culture. Powell is said to have donated these objects in the 1880s to the university when he was head of the Bureau of Ethnology. The records on these items, though, were lost in the Heading Hall fire of 1943. Yes, you might not know that Powell authored the Illinois Wesleyan motto, knowledge and wisdom. Did you know that there was a 29-minute documentary film on the Grand Canyon produced by Walt Disney, and it was shown with Sleeping Beauty during its initial run? So if you took the family to see Sleeping Beauty in 1958, you were also treated to a 29-minute narrative documentary with classical music with sweeping views of the Grand Canyon. Doesn't that sound like something children would love today? But nonetheless, the composer was Ferdinand Grofé. So is this middlebrow or is this fine art? You make the call, right? But what's interesting here, heck, thought Walt, right? Walt Disney. We shot a lot of film, right, of the Grand Canyon. So why can't we repurpose some of this footage and use it in a theatrical release? Maybe kind of mix it in with a family adventure film, which leads us to, yes, Walt Disney's treatment of Powell's 1869 expedition, which was the 1960 film 10 Who Dared. John Elterick lent me the DVD a while back. John's a volunteer. Maybe he's listening in. So John and I might be the only two in a long shot that have seen this film. I would not recommend it. And yes, that's Brian Keith. That's Brian Keith, who is playing William Dunn. And hey, right, we're celebrating the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of America, the Declaration of Independence, so it makes sense to have a comic book. What could be more American than a comic book, right, from 1967? Not a very factual recreation of the 1869 expedition, but what is this graphic novel that came out in 2019, published by Abrams Fanfare. It's a wonderful overview of Powell's life and career and that famed 1869 expedition. Disaster, Powell exclaims, right, in the lower frames. While Billy Hawkins notes with relief, the men are safe, right? But Powell seems more concerned with other things. The barometers were on that boat, he replies. So yeah, they did a really wonderful job if you're interested. You can also get a paper Powell, right? Some of you may know Flat Stanley, right? You trim them out, you color them, and then you take them on a family vacation, and Flat Stanley is photographed at the Eiffel Tower or wherever. You can take now your paper Powell to the Grand Canyon, which I'm sure many people have. There's even a play written in 2015 by Jacqueline Blackhouse called Men on Boats. It had its off-Broadway debut in 2016. It was performed at Illinois Wesleyan in 2022. I caught it there. And then in early 2023, lo and behold, it was staged at Illinois State University. Yes, it's called Men on Boats, but the play is specifically written for an all-female cast. So you get kind of a twist. It's a respectful and accurate account of the Powell expedition, but it's also a study in that most frightfully weighted word of our time, masculinity, right? So, but if you have a chance to see this, I would recommend it. And I couldn't help but grab my smartphone and take a shot as I was tooling around in Bloomington. And hauling got me thinking about photography, because during Powell's second expedition and all the survey work that followed, hauling photographic equipment was quite the thing. At this time, landscape photographers employed what was called the wet plate process. This consisted of evenly coating glass plates with a substance called collodion. The plate was then taken into a darkroom tent and bathed for 1 minute in silver nitrate, right? That was the key. The plate was then placed in a plate holder, inserted into a previously aimed and focused camera. Finally, the camera lens was uncapped. For how long? Several seconds, or as long as many minutes, depending on the aperture of the lens or the ambient light at the time. The 1871 river expedition included more than 1,000 pounds of photographic equipment, most of it in very fragile, large glass plates, if you could imagine that. If you haven't read a good biography on Powell, you're in luck. There are several or more of them. Wallace Stegner in 1954. Wallace Stegner, National Book Award winner, beautiful novelist, short story writer, essayist, environmentalist, headed the Stanford University Writing School. Just brilliant. Kind of got interest in Powell going again in the middle of the 20th century. That was followed by a doorstop of a book published by Oxford University Press by Donald Wooster. Donald Wooster, University of Kansas, I'm sure he's retired by now, really one of the, if not the fathers of American environmental historians. So for him to tackle John Wesley Powell says a lot, right? What did he do next? He went on to John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club. And then John F. Ross's 2018 book, right? That was the most recent pick of the History Reads Book Club, sponsored by Bloomington Public Library and our museum. And Marcia Thomas, who I pointed out earlier, living locally and being the leading authority on John Wesley Powell, she served as John Ross's primary researcher for the book. So that's a pretty big deal too, right? Well, I hope I was successful in illustrating how Powell addressed the fate of Native peoples, at least a little, as well as addressing issues such as water and land conservation. He wanted development to proceed wisely, supported by science, and the benefits to be shared by as many people as possible. Powell was asking in his own way, what does it mean to be an American? It's a question we're still stumbling about. trying to answer today, 250 years after the signing of the Declaration. So I'm going to give the last words to Western writer John Vernon, quoting from the 2004 Arid Lands reprint. He wrote the foreword. This is John Vernon, another wonderful writer and essayist. Will the real John Wesley Powell please stand up? Is he the proto-environmentalist, the lover of Western landscapes, the preservationist who advocated limited settlement of the West? Is he, as biographer Donald Wooster asserts, the ethnologist whose attitude to Native Americans was unusually sympathetic and humane for its time? Or was he the career administrator who saw the West as a treasure house of mineral, timber, and agricultural resources that could be, quote, recovered only when Indians were removed? Of course, the answer is John Wesley Powell was all of the above. He may have been ahead of his time, but he was also of his time, right? And this is the end. Powell passed away September 23rd, 1902, 69 years old, sadly. For such a sharp person, he suffered from dementia later in life. The collections of the Smithsonian Institution of Natural History include John Wesley Powell's brain floating in a jar of alcohol. Powell had made a bet with his friend W.J. McGee. W.J. McGee was president of the National Geographic Society, and they bet, yes, whose brain was bigger, right? So when Powell died, his brain was shipped, though first to anthropologist Edward Spitzka, who enjoyed weighing and comparing the brains of prominent men, and then taken to the Smithsonian. Well, McGee died in 1912, and his brain then was shipped, I believe, to Spitzka and then to the Smithsonian. Powell won the bet, right? but he wasn't around to enjoy it, right? So thank you so much. You folks have been great and very patient. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'm sure we have a few minutes for that. So thank you so much.
Any questions? And wait till I get to you with the microphone so our viewers at home can hear your question.
Did Powell design the Wesleyan seal or just the phrase?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if the Latin term, the phrase, comes from him. But I don't know about the seal itself. That's a good question.
The illustration that you had, it was not the original seal.
Right.
So I don't know.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you know more than I do. So that's a question for Liz Bloodworth. Yeah, good. Interesting. Yeah.
Oh, wait.
I just wondered, is there any more information on his wife? Because it seems like she was out there in that wild country quite a bit.
I
kind of mentioned as a companion.
Yeah, and that's on me, of course, right? But I only have so much time. But certainly, she was out there. You know, she wasn't on the boats, but she was in the Utah Territory. And living a pretty hard life. Their daughter's born in 1872 or 3, Mary, right, in Salt Lake City, right, which was a Mormon settlement at the time. So she sacrificed a tremendous amount, right, to travel with her husband from the arid lands of the West to D.C. and back and forth by rail, which was certainly no picnic, in the Gilded Age. So, there's a story there as well. Yeah.
I was intrigued by that picture of whoever, I've forgotten who was on the cliff.
Yeah.
How on earth did they take that picture, and how did a single man get up that huge cliff? And that was unbelievable at that particular time.
Yeah, I can't answer for them, that's for sure, but they did a lot of scrambling, climbing, and things of that nature. So, And again, right, Powell, one arm, right? But he's doing a lot of this kind of stuff, and it's not really being talked about. Part of that is the time, right? It's a little still improper, impolite. But there's just so many people without limbs, right? It's the end of the Civil War. Tens of thousands of men, both North and South, have limbs missing. So what Powell is going through is not really all that different or that uncommon, right? Funny stories, he would, lobby legislators, lawmakers, cajole them. Anytime he would buy a pair of gloves, he would only need one glove, right? And he would give the left glove to a legislator that only had a left hand, who had lost his right in the war, or the vice versa, I should say. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
How on earth did the people who decided not to stay with him get back? I mean, you talked about the 3 that got killed, but what about the other ones? How on earth do you, in the middle of the Colorado River, decide you're going to go back home?
So only the Englishman, Frank Goodman, he's the only one to walk back, and that was after several weeks on the Green River. So he walked back to Green River, Wyoming. Then they lost the 3 at Separation Rapids. They climbed out of the Grand Canyon to the North Plateau. They wanted to make their way to a Mormon settlement, which was about a 4-day trek, but then were killed by Paiutes for some mysterious reason. The rest of the men, 5 men, remained with Powell. So at the end of the journey, Powell had everybody but the 3 men he lost and the Englishman that walked back early on. So.
The Ross book was really good that we discussed for the History Reads book club, so I can't not highly recommend it. Really well written, really easy to understand, and it goes into all those details about the ones they lost, the ones that walked back. So really a great read to add into addition to what Bill's program went into. Rose, did you have another question?
What was the building that you said the photo of him is in the art at Wesleyan? What building?
Well, North Hall was the only building at Wesleyan when. That's Ames Library. Yeah, that's the library. Yes. So. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Yep. Yes. Anybody can go to Ames Library. Absolutely. Yes.
I just wanted to mention there's a paper Powell and flat Stanley. We also have flat Lincolns downstairs in the visitor center, so you can get them for your next vacation.
And I also have to mention, when we used to host the Tri-Valley History Fair here, John Wesley Powell was a frequent subject of many students' history fair projects, so much so that one year, one of the students made a life-sized Powell mannequin replica, complete with missing arm, and much to the chagrin of all of our volunteers on the first floor, they would scold me because they'd catch the mannequin out of the corner of their eyes and think it was a real person there. And I know there's a photo that exists somewhere of that mannequin, which did win a prize for best, McLean County history project one year, so I was kind of sad I never saw that picture in Bill's program tonight, but it was one of my favorite projects, although most of the volunteers hated it. Any other questions this evening? Oh.
If the government would look back at what he suggested and try to recreate that, would it help our situation?
Yeah, but it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle, right? With so much of that land, now held privately. Though, much of it still is owned by the federal government, right? The Bureau of Reclamation, I think they handle rangeland. I might have that right. They might be the largest landowner in the West, larger than certainly the National Park Service or even the U.S. Forest Service. So, there's a potential there to do certain things like that, certainly, in the future, right? Never stop dreaming, that's for sure. Yes.
One more question.
Well, not a question, but a comment. There is another older book by Elmo Scott Watson, who I believe was a Wesleyan professor, and it's called The Professor Goes West. And it has a lot of information, including about Emma Dean Powell, and also another character from the Wesleyan and other local connections, H.C. DeMott, who was on, I think, the second expedition, and his wife. Was he two of them? Okay. So anyway, he's another, we could do another whole program on him and his connection to this and to this community and the state in general. But that account by Elmo Scott Watson has a lot of really interesting detail as well.
And that book is digitized by archives.org, because spoiler alert, you're going to hear about H.C. DeMott in a future PFOP and his journeys west, because we have a really great accounts of DeMott's that were published in Wesleyan's alumni journal, about 4 months worth of his stories. So end of the month, you'll see that Pieces from the Past. So let's give Bill another round of applause. Thank you so much. And I hope you will join us for our next program, rescheduled, A History of Bicycling in Illinois with Christopher Sweet. No Central Illinois storm will keep us down. So next Thursday, August 27th at Bloomington Public Library at 6:30, we'll have the history of bicycling in Central Illinois, complete with 2 vintage bicycles. One of which is the Penny Farthing, AKA high wheeler bike, but I'm sorry, you cannot ride them, so sorry. But you can pick up Christopher's book there, he will be signing them. It will also be available online for viewers at home. All that information about that program and more programs coming up on our website, makehistory.org, or you can pick up some info on the tables. And with that, thank you all for coming.